session of the 2022 to 2023 session of Say Say Borak. And I'm Yu Hng. I'm a composer and teacher from Singapore, and I'm actually currently based in the UK. For this session, the topic will be on experimentalism within popular music. So I'm quite delighted to say that the Composer Society of Singapore has also invited Joseph Tham, an independent researcher who is very knowledgeable on experimental trends in pop music, with a focus on the Singaporean context. So let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so this is how I will organize the session. So there will be, the first half will be by me, and the second half will be by Joseph. There will be a Q&A at the end of each half. So at the end of my half, there will be a short Q&A, maybe 5 to 10 minutes. And then after that, I'll let Joseph introduce himself and his work during the second half. All right. I think to start off our session, let's listen to a song by the Beatles. It might not be one that you're familiar with. So let's listen to maybe 2 or 3 minutes of this work. All right. All right, let's pause here. It's quite a long song. Again, it's quite unusual for Beatles work. Most pop music at that time is maybe 2.5 to 3 minutes. But right here, we have around 8 minutes. So let's look at the features of this rather strange Beatles song and its context within the wider musical world at that time. Right, so some features of the song. Firstly, it uses a sound collage. So what it does is that it glues together various sound samples. Some of it is from music, some of it is from it's like a found sound that they take from the streets, and it's not always in context. So the individual parts are clearly quite recognizable, but their relationship with each other is not very clear. Okay, and this is related to this aesthetic trend in music called musique concrète, which was developed in Paris during the late 1940s by composers such as Pierre Schaeffer and Stockhausen. So what this style of music does is it uses recorded everyday sounds like bells and trains, and then uses it as musical materials. At that time, audio production techniques were quite new, so they were trying to use such technology to connect and manipulate the sounds and see if they can form a coherent whole. Right. Okay. There's also Stockhausen's influence on John Lennon, who is part of the Beatles. So there's this scholar, Richardson, who said that there's a likelihood that Lennon knew Stockhausen's work, Hymnen and Gesang der Jungling, and that these two works, they are quite alike in various aspects. The last thing is also the fact that this is a very, very long work, right? It's actually the longest work by the Beatles, and it's very unusual for a work of a popular song. Okay. All right. Let's go on to the next. So I'm going through 3 pieces today. The first one is this piece by the Beatles. The second one is by a sort of avant-garde rap group called Y, and the very last piece is by the Shags. So they all have different aesthetics about them. So let's go on to the next piece.
Mixtape, the last streetlight stay on well after dawn. King's fall to Ponzi, drop the needle, let the song say it. The kind of morgue with a gong to tell you when. But the room's rules bend and the staff will make you laugh. My dad wore this face in old photographs. Calico cats out, scare me from behind a junkyard fence. High on cot, I let my stare go soft, but pretend it's not. When I'm odd, I turn my bottom teeth and look at the sidewalk in front of me as my tennis shoes go in and out of the frame. Another sleep-footed empty ride, walking on goose eggs in the mission. Swap meet, brown 31 fishnet hat cocked to the right. I only played chess once in my life and I lost. Sky for shooting horses under. Looks like a sky for shooting horses under. Looks like a good sky to die under.
All right. Okay, so I think before I go into the musical features of this song, I think it's worth exploring the lyrics from a literary perspective. Okay. So if you take a look at the lyrics are on the left side of this screen, and I've also included a poem by the Surrealist poet Andre Breton. And from my analysis of the lyrics and of other songs of this band, there are quite a lot of avant-garde literary techniques as well. Okay, so I think before that, I shall go a bit into the context of surrealism. So surrealism is this artistic movement in the 1920s centered in France. And surrealist literature is very influenced by Freudian psychoanalysis. So it's interested in things like dreams and unconscious thought rather than reason and logic. So there's a dreamlike quality to such poetry where various objects or various elements in the artwork have seemingly no relation to each other. Okay, maybe maybe if I read the poem by Bulletin, just maybe the first few lines, right? The colorless gases are in abeyance. 2,300 scruples, snow of the well springs, smiles are acknowledged. Don't give sailors promises, the lions of the poles. The sea, the natural sand, the great parrot of poor parents. Country sojourn of the oceans. 7 o'clock in the evening, night of the land of rabies. Finances sea salt. Summer's lovely hand is alone to be seen, the cigarettes of the dying. So if you notice the words here, it doesn't flow in a necessarily chronological or narrative way. For example, it says smiles acknowledge, don't give sailors promises. But what is the context here? Right, it's not very clear. So in a lot of surrealist poetry, there's decontextualization. There's the taking of short phrases, and it seems removed from the context that they come from. And what they do is that all these little fragments of words, or what I call word images, they are juxtaposed together into a collage. It's quite similar to artworks, surrealist artworks, such as those by Salvador Dali. So if you see, I'm not sure if you guys know the very famous one with the melted clocks. So it's something like that. It's taking everyday objects and then juxtaposing them together to form a very dreamlike whole. And it's quite similar with the lyrics of this song called "A Sky for Showing Horses Under." In fact, even the title itself is quite strange. You're not very sure what's the context for that, right? A sky for shoeing horses. So shoeing horses is really literally putting on those hooves for the horses. And if you look at the lyrics, it has nothing much to do with that. Right? He talks about "There's Rain Goes Perfect" with the North Star mixtape. So it seems like he's listening to music. But then after that, he talks about kings falling to pawns. And then he talks about what his dad looks like in old photographs. So there seems to be these disparate images that just flows through like a very fast stream of consciousness. All right, let's maybe take a look at the next slide. So there's also a very unusual structure here, right? There's a single and large verse, and there's a single chorus ending the song. So this is not like most works of popular music. You usually have a verse, then a chorus, verse, chorus. Then you might have a bridge, and then you end off with chorus again, with some variations to this structure, right? But over here, you have either a very large verse or several verses joined together, and you only have one, like an outro. The chorus functions as an outro, like a postlude to the verses. There's also ambiguity in this song. What is the subject matter of the lyrics? It's not very clear. There's a very subtle fusion of genres too. There's clearly rap. There's a bit of psychedelic rock, at least to my ears. And there's possibly some minimalist elements as well, especially the cantus firmus that plays at the start, right? And then there's also this idea of humor that emerges from this decontextualization. So what happened is that they took all these lyrics seemingly from various sources, almost like quotations, and they jumble them together as word images. And some of them are juxtaposed with each other to a humorous effect. So there's this final line to the rapped verse called I only played chess once in my life and I lost. And it happened just right at the end of the first verse here. So it's almost like there's a lot of random images, and suddenly at the end there's this line there. And it's also the way the various lines are arranged. So if you put this final line in somewhere in the middle of the rap, it wouldn't have that big of a rhetorical effect as well. All right, so I think the point I wish to bring across in this song is that when it comes to experimentalism in popular music, these songs don't just experiment with the musical style or the kind of techniques used. So in the Beatles song, you see the techniques being quite experimental. It's very influenced by trends in contemporary classical music in the 20th century. But for this particular song, it also experiments with literature as well. Let's look at one final piece by the Shags. So it's also relatively short, so we can listen to the whole. Okay, we're done with this very curious sounding song. I think the most obvious feature of this song is that it sounds as if these are a group of musicians that really just can't play music, right? There's this feeling of ineptness, right? So some features, and I'm sure you can spot more. So there's the wrong placement of drum beats. What I found quite funny was the rather unnecessary drum solo at the end of the song. And also there seems to be this like drum interlude that you think the song was going to end, then they restarted singing again. Okay. I think also very obvious is the very, very out of tune guitars. A lot of times they are also strumming the guitar chords without muting the unneeded strings. So for those who are not guitarists, they usually when you play the guitar, you need to mute some of the strings, because if you play across if you strum across, some of those other strings will sound. So there's the strumming of these chords without muting them. The guitars are not tuned properly. And there's also seemingly wrong entries for the vocals. Another element is the lyrics. So usually lyrics, there's a way to accent them, just as in speaking. So there is a very unusual and almost mechanical accenting for the lyrics. Everything seems wrong, basically. Okay, so let's pay attention to the lyrics themselves. Okay, so it's about the band's lost cat, Foot Foot, right? And if you notice the lyrics, it's quite repetitive. They are very repetitive phrases like, my pal's name is Foot Foot. He always likes to roam. My pal's name is Foot Foot. I never find him home. All right. There is also a very simple vocabulary and what I call a childlike idiolect. So it's the choice of words that are used. Usually you'll say my friend or my cat's, right? My cat's name is Foot Foot. But he says, the speaker says, my pal's name is Foot Foot. And again, the word pal is something that a young child would say. Also notice the brevity of the lines. It's not very, very long. It's quite simple in its rhythmic structure. So in a single stanza, the second and the fourth line rhymes. And so there's a evocation of childlike lament there. It's very innocent, but at the same time you sense that there's sadness there too. And this is where that illusion of ineptness fits with the lyrics very well. Because right here, the lyrics is about a child who lost, or is like a child who lost the cat. And the way the music is played is almost as if it's done by someone very young who might not have musical training. This is a very interesting comment about the Shags. I think it's one of the most apt description of this band. So the Shags are real, pure, unaffected by outside influences. Their music is different. It is theirs alone. They believe in it, live it. It is a part of them, and they are a part of it. Yeah, so there's this sense that the Shags, the way they engage in experimentalism is actually by going in the opposite direction, right? They use this illusion of childlikeness and trained incompetence, but it's actually a form of experimentalism because when they play such music, it's deliberate. They deliberately play it with all these wrong techniques, right? And there's also this idea of trained incompetence as humor. There are some reviews on the web when they first heard this song. Well, they found it hilarious. In fact, people were quite polarized about this band when this album was first released. And although their reviews were quite bad at the start, but over time they gained a huge cult following, and right now it's perceived as one of the you can argue is one of the key repertoires in the art pop world. I really like this particular line that their music is different. It is theirs alone. And it is almost as if this particular niche, this aesthetic niche is really something that the Shags do. And it's qualitatively different from other trends in experimental music. All right, so let's talk a bit about, let's talk a bit more about the broad context of experimentalism in pop music. Yeah, so usually I will talk about context before going into the works, but I want you guys to hear the works first and then see them within this wider context. Right. So is there popular acclaim to experimental pop music? Right. And I actually went across the web and I tried looking at the YouTube views for all these various songs. I only wrote a few here, but there are quite a lot more that I hear over the years. And although there are some very popular ones, like for example, the Shags and Beatles, even their experimental works, there is a rather large fan base that listens to them, right? But for most others, actually, the views are really, really quite small. And on Revolution 9, right, most listeners loathe it outright, with the dedicated fans trying to understand it. Which is interesting. I think that the word "trying to understand" as opposed to the dedicated fans understand it. So it's almost as if there's a small subset of listeners which are connoisseurs of such music. And I find a very strong parallel with contemporary classical music. You do have listeners of classical music, but there will be less listeners for the contemporary music from the 20th century onwards. And it's the same in the pop music world. A lot of popular works are exactly as what the genre says, right? Popular. But there's also a smaller group of dedicated fans who listen to the more experimental pop music. Hey, the second thing I want to talk about is this idea of isolated or integrated experimental communities. And by that, I refer to the fact that each genre have their own experimental side. So like experimental jazz, contemporary classical, intelligent dance music as opposed to the more popular EDM, or maybe progressive rock, progressive metal, as opposed to mainstream rock. So do these experimental communities, is there a lot of cross-fertilization? So that there seems to be some inspiration from contemporary classical music. So for example, John Lennon and Stockhausen. There's a lot of influence of Stockhausen on the work of the Beatles through John Lennon. And you do have more popular trends in contemporary classical music, such as minimalism. So the works of Terry Riley, the works of Steve Reich, do influence a lot of pop musicians. Okay. However, many other experimental genres seem to be inspired from within their own genre, right? So for example, IDM emerges from EDM, and experimental rock also emerging from mainstream rock traditions. The last thing I want to talk a bit about is the relationship with literature. Due to the lyrics-heavy nature of popular music, experimental pop music also engages frequently in lyrical experimentation. All right, I have some citations here if you guys are interested in reading. I'm happy to share it with you all. So that will be the end of my presentation here. I will go into a short session of Q&A, maybe just 5 minutes, all right? So if you guys have any questions. I think Joseph mentioned something. He said that the album cover, the white album, was designed by Richard Hamilton. Yeah, this is interesting. Yeah, and how it's influential on both the art scene and the popular scene, right? Yeah, what I personally notice is that there is more cross-fertilization between various genres, between so-called highbrow and more vernacular music in the 70s, 80s, and to some extent the 90s. But over the last 20 years, there seems to be less communication. There seems to be less aesthetic cross-fertilization between the various experimental communities and the more vernacular ones.
Maybe I just jump in at this point in time. I thought,
Yeah.
I think just now Yu Hng alluded to the notion of what experimentalism means. I think we should position it as a term that is relative. So basically, when something is experimental, it usually comes across as something new, modernist, noise, even to most of the audience at the point in time. But over time, you realize that perhaps it would be gradually accepted and might become part of the canon. I think historically, musicologically, it tend to have that tendency. So, for example, if you look at the modern classical world, you have the second Viennese school of Schoenberg and his three disciples. His two disciples, Anton Webern and Berg. All right. I mean, it was considered as very dissonant. It was unmusical, blah blah. But look at what happened after the Second World War when Stockhausen, Pierre Boulez, and the guys, in Western Europe, took their idea to the limit. It was not seen as experimental anymore. It was seen as the establishment. So I think even in the popular music world, what some artists had done might sound or might come across as experimental, but over time it became part of the mainstream, so to speak. Hip hop is actually one very good example. So I think sometimes when we look at experimentalism, it might be applicable maybe for that moment, for at that specific time and space. So that's the first thing. I think second thing is about popular music. So I mean the Shacks, I mean, we position them as popular music because they are not classical, they are not jazz, they are not world music. But how popular are they? I mean, if you really want to go into the meaning of the word popular, so that there's also this issue here. Popular by generic definition, or popular by a more audience reception angle. So I think these are things that we need to think about also when we are even trying to unpack today's theme. Yeah, my 2 cents worth.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing. That was very insightful. Yeah. Anyone else have thoughts?
I think maybe one observation for me is that this kind of, the parallels I draw is kind of like from like cult versus religion, in terms of, when do you really go mainstream versus, when it's just embraced by a very small group of people. And I'm just wondering out loud, I don't know if anyone has an opinion, like, at some point, if, for example, if you're a master of like promotion, right, and you can manage to somehow, whether you spend the money or you somehow be able to get people to widely acknowledge and hear or embrace it, then you make it mainstream, right? I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, that's a very interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to use those the religious metaphors, right? Yeah, I was actually thinking of yesterday's heterodoxy becoming today's orthodoxy, something like that. And I think it does apply to some extent in the music world. I mean, as what Joseph was saying, right? He was talking about the second Viennese school, the kind of serialist music, dodecaphonic music. And that was very experimental at that time. But if you look at some of the universities these days, especially in continental Europe, you are expected to write in some of that style. Sometimes it can be quite strict. Yeah, so it has been internalized, incorporated into the mainstream way of teaching in a lot of institutions also.
I thought another point is the whole notion of canonization, because it's also not so simple as in cult versus a widely accepted religion. There are composers, we don't even talk about the popular music scene. There have been composers who were not so popular during their time, or they were more cult favorites. But perhaps after their death, or due to the proselytization of some patrons subsequently, they became accepted. And there were also those who were very popular during their time. They're almost rock star-like. But later years, they might not be actually highly revered as some of those people who are whom we are very familiar with today. Yeah, so I think that there's this very interesting synthesis of public opinion, experts, critics, and so on and so forth interplaying, and somehow things got out of fashion, things become part of the fashion, and it sometimes can be quite fluid due to the varying historical context and so on and so forth.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really great point, right? Because I think sometimes what we consider mainstream or fringe is also dependent on that public appeal. And also I think the sort of reverse is true, where sometimes people are pushing boundaries. Certain pop musicians are pushing boundaries, but because they are so famous, we don't see that as experimental and as part of that avant-garde. It was just, but they were trendsetters in a way. I'm thinking of maybe like Lady Gaga's music. You know, it's actually very popular, you know, during the late 2000s. But it's also that she was kind of prefiguring the EDM movement along with a few other pop musicians. So she was moving the trend forward, but it's also the way the river moves, right? She's pushing the river, and then the river went in that direction. But there are also others who they composed works that went off in a, you can say, in a different direction as well. Yeah, and that was considered fringe, just because they did not set the mainstream, they did not do the trend setting.
Something Joseph mentioned was how it's kind of important perhaps to come up with a definition of what we think of as popular music. And I think the same goes for what we think of the definition of the word experimental, because I think the Shags, like, if they were doing an experiment, I don't know that there was any like resultant that they discovered anything after doing this experiment, and I also don't necessarily think they were doing anything new. They perhaps presented it in a way because they were signed and had a record company and could be played on the radio. But I think like artists like Bjork and the Residents, who, like you mentioned, are like hugely popular with millions and millions of fans, and the experiment that they've been doing has lasted 40 years. I mean, I think it's tried and true. Bjork is no longer experimenting. She knows what works and what her fans love, and there's no longer an experiment. I mean, I like it a lot, but it's certainly not the same as it was when I heard it 20 years ago, when it sounded fresh and new. Now it sounds great, but it sort of feels like she's found her niche, like you said.
Yeah, that's a good point you mentioned, where do the experiments, do they form Tradents, which is really the title of today's talk, today's webinar, right? So do they outlast their own genesis? And it also raises questions about whether your experiment, is it something that lasts, or is it just something that's quite frivolous, right? And what are the Shags doing? Do they do the kind of insights, if any, they've done, has it outlasted them in a way, or is it a sort of cul-de-sac? And I think that's something we can debate. Yeah, I think I'll pass over the time to Joseph.
Thanks.
So he'll be doing the second half of it. Yeah.
Let me just allow me to share my screen.
Yeah.
Okay. I think I'll keep my section short. I thought it'd be good to share with you a bit of myself and also what we're doing. Before I segue into giving two Singaporean bands who have been known for being experimental for a number of years. Okay, just to share with you, I used to be a co-owner of this record shop in Singapore almost 20 years ago, called Flux Us. So what the shop does is this: besides selling CDs and records, we were also doing quite a number of in-store. So quite a number of artists who came by Singapore. We actually got them to perform in-store in Singapore. We in fact did one concert at the concert hall near Singapore River. All right. So most of them will be known as experimental musicians. All right. So noise musicians, improvising musicians, free jazz, and so on and so forth. All right. So this is the context that I came from. So afterwards, what I've done is because the shop was set up at the wrong time. It was the period when downloading was at its peak. Physical format has not come back yet. I mean, if those of you who are aware, vinyl has made a comeback, a return. So now everyone's paying huge amount of money for vinyl issues and so on and so forth. All right, vinyl is so popular that vinyl factories have to put you on waiting lists, for the various record companies in the world to get their orders sorted out before they can sell to their fans and the consumers in the market today. So that was a very, very interesting time. All right, so afterwards, what I've done is I went into writing. So I actually was invited by one of the CSS Pao, Zhu Pao. I think those of you who know him, all right, I think he's doing quite a lot of work for CSS. All right, so he got me to write a chapter on Singapore popular music in this book called Singapore Soundscape, which was published by NLB about 10 years ago. Myself, I also wrote a chapter about noise music, but not Singapore, but a look more at the history of noise music up to maybe around 1980. So it was published by Bloomsbury under this anthology called Resonances. Okay. I also wrote quite a bit on sound art. So basically, those are the areas that I've been interested in. So from there, I think maybe that's the reason why I asked those questions about looking at the definition of experimentalism as well as popular, because I always have issue with those terms. I don't have any good substitutes for them. I see them more as placeholding terms most of the time. Yeah. So I thought that is something that I thought I want to share with you. I also wrote for this local e-journal called Spores, all right, which actually documents quite a bit of Singapore culture of all sorts. So from popular culture to politics to literature and so on and so forth. So do take a look at this particular website. So some of the quite illustrious local academics, people like Chua Bing Huat, Daniel Goh, all right, they are the editorial team, all right, of this. Okay, so I think from there, I thought I want to share with you about this local band called the Observatory. I'm not sure how many of you have heard of them. They are one of the few bands operating in the more popular scene that has been given grants by NAC. Because most of the time, the grants given by NAC are to the classical or the jazz musicians. Very few of them are from the popular music scene. So they are one of them. Okay, they have evolved over the years. So you can see here the picture on the left, all right, is the current lineup. The picture on the right is actually an older lineup. Okay, some of the founding members have left. So the band, actually, the interesting thing is it started out as more of a folk rock, folk kind of lineup. But over the years, it has morphed into something more dynamic. They incorporated things like modern classical, incorporated things like noise, incorporated things like free jazz, and so on and so forth. And in recent years, they have been working with a lot of musicians from Norway and Japan. And more interesting about this band is that they don't just produce their works, they are also a nodal point of the Southeast Asian and East Asia musical network. So their grants actually include organizing festivals and concerts in Singapore, all right, highlighting some of the local as well as Southeast Asian and East Asian scenes. Okay, so some of their gigs can be seen here. So they are called Play Freely, which is a very interesting concept about improvisation. where different artists will first improvise and then they will move into duets or trios even. All right, culminating in all together in one kind of improv finale. Okay, so a lot of them were featured in Southeast Asia. So just now, actually, Brian, you mentioned Björk. Okay, so the latest Björk album feature one of the artists who came to Singapore through the observatory. Okay, so it's called Gabber Modus Operandi. So the very Gabber-like kind of beats that you hear on the latest Björk album actually is the product of this Indonesian duo from Bali Island. Yeah, so just to let you know. So Björk was pretty tuned in, and she actually invited them to be part of the production team on her latest album. Okay, another group that is quite different, even though we call them experimental, is SB Distro Fly. So if you are aware of this term, it's actually a literary term. It's actually taken from one of the books. Okay, I'll leave it to you to find out which book it came from. It is actually a duo. All right, this lady here is the lead singer. Usually you'll see the guy. The guy is the main musician behind, but they write the songs together. So I would describe their music as ethereal, ambient, a bit post-rock, quite an interesting mix. They function in a slightly different circle. They actually have their own label called Kitchen label. Some of the artists that they release on their label has performed at Esplanade before. They are pretty big in Japan as well as some parts of Asia and selected cities in Europe as well as the west coast of the US. Okay, so you can see here that the experimental examples that I gave here, they are not just artists in their own rights, but they also serve as conduits in a wider network of experimental or experimental-minded artists. So it's very interesting that there is this this notion that they seek out like-minded people. They try to support one another to provide that kind of grounds up, I would say, dissemination, either through event organizing or setting up an institution like a record label to distribute their work, to share their work. And I think that's one way I think experimental musicians have been doing over the years. So it's nothing new, but I think in Singapore, this is something that has only started taking place maybe for the past 10 or 15 years. So in the Singapore context, this is pretty different because we know that when we talk about music scene in Singapore, aside from the flowering back in the late 60s and early 70s, there have only been, I would say, small little booms, since the 80s. Most of them tend to be more from the mainstream. So people like, I think the most recent one you can think of people like Sam Willows. And then there are two bands that are making a bit of waves overseas. All right. So I thought they are pretty different from most of the musicians, all right, in the popular music scene in Singapore. Okay, so with that, I thought I would just stop. Yeah. So I thought one way is to actually share with you some of these bands in Singapore that you might not have heard of, but they're actually doing quite a bit of stuff in a more experimental field. Okay, for the past 1.5 decades. Yeah, but I think another way to look at experimentalism today is a network, which I think you can talk more from a more historical point of view, musicological point of view. I think I come in more from the cultural studies and maybe sociological point of view. Yeah, so I hope that complements, all right, what Yu Hng has shared. Yeah. So actually, I'm done actually from my part. So I thought maybe let's have some interesting discourse or the discussion, or just talk about what we have heard today. Yeah.
Oh, I'm quite interested in, because after you introduced to me a few weeks back on the observatory, and I actually went to listen to their stuff on YouTube and all that. And I realized they do work with it. There's a very visual element to their music as well.
Yeah.
In fact, I really like it because for me, I like installation art personally. So when I see them sort of combining that sort of art pop music with with visual arts, especially those installations. To me, that's quite fascinating. And do you know of how do those two elements relate in this context?
Okay, I can share a bit more about that, because especially for the current lineup of the observatory, Chi Wai, who joined the band about 10 years ago, he himself is actually a graphic designer. So that explains the visual art aspect. And he participated in the first Singapore Arts Biennale back in the mid 2000s. So I think from that you can see where the visual art comes from. But he himself is also a musician. He's a guitarist first, and then he dabbled in other instruments as well. I guess this is where things come together. Along the way, some of the past members, they have always been interested in collaboration, either with visual artists. So sometimes they also work with theatre groups. So they design sound pieces for some of the local theatre performances. I think you all would know Li Chuan. I'm not very sure if you know Li Chuan. Li Chuan is also someone who knows quite a lot of people in the composer scene. He himself is actually a composer, but I think in recent years he has moved more towards the electronic, also soundtracking of theatre scene as well. So I guess it is that circle of people who are a bit more polymatic in the outlook of how they approach their art, as well as how they produce their art. There's a lot of intermedia, multimedia collaboration or mindset. Yeah, partially for survival. Singapore is quite difficult to survive as artists. Yeah, partially is also for from their own interest in working in more than one art form. Yeah, I guess that's the reason why you find that. But I think it's more so in recent years. Yeah, the earlier version when the two founding members, Leslie Low and Vivian Wong, when they were in, perhaps slightly less so. Yeah.
So maybe a question for me as a layman, right? In terms of, we often see a lot of music sound installations in whether it's festivals, exhibitions, and all of that. So where does it, I guess, happen where there's the art in the form of where you see it there versus like a recorded album versus the experimentalism, where does it start and stop, right? When is it considered art? When is it considered, that? Like, how do you get that, or how do you define that?
Okay, Cindy, I have to tell you, if you were to ask 100 people, they will give you 100 different things of that. I guess that's the exciting part. That's the fun part of it. Even the line between noise and music. Post-Cage, frankly speaking, how do we define noise and music, right? And of course, Cage was not the only one. There were so many people after him. The Fluxus movement. You also have people who collapse definitions and things like that. There's also a very, very well known. I'm not very sure you heard of him. French philosopher, politician called Jacques Attali. He wrote this book called Noise and Political Economy of Music. So he talked a lot about how music actually morphed over time from something that is very functional to people's life to something that is more liturgical, more religious, more faith-based, to something that's more secular. But because it was held in the hands of the music industry, all right, so that it was in many ways oligarchical kind of arrangement. But I think in today's world with the internet, whether it's a consumption or production of music, it has become a lot more democratized. If you want to produce something and upload into Bandcamp or SoundCloud or Spotify, no one can stop you, because these are ready platforms for you to do so. So I guess compared to maybe 200 years ago, when if you were to write a piece of music and actually performing it, you need to have some sponsor, patrons. So the royalty or the bourgeoisie class back then would be the one who have to bankroll that enterprise. So it's pretty different from today. So I think going back to what Cindy has said is that I think the whole notion of art is also contestable, because I think when we talk about art for art's sake, as well as art as artisanal practice, or art as something that is public art, I think everyone has different notion. So I think when we look at albums, you can actually see album as something that is more music. Okay, so for example, when you have Sam Willow producing an album, that's an album. I mean, it is meant to be a piece of pop music. It's meant to be consumed as such. But some artists sometimes release albums as well because they want to document their work. But the problem with sound art is that a lot of times it is multimodal. So being deprived of its other senses or other sensual reception, so it is a bit lacking, I would say, for some of the works. It depends on the conception of it, especially if they involve other senses like, sight and maybe touch even. So I think sometimes it really depends on the intention behind it, and actually I would say which carries the art best. All right, would be a better way to look at how the art should be positioned or exhibited or even produced in the market. But I would say it can get very complex if we were to really go deep into it, frankly. But I thought just a very simple sharing of what I personally feel, based on what Cindy has asked. Yeah, I hope I addressed a bit of what Cindy has said, or to try to find out.
Yeah, thanks for that.
I actually thought that was very cool. What you mentioned about sound art, it cannot be reduced to that sound format, right? It's very much something that it's a multi-sensory experience. And I remember you just reminded me, it was a fantastic experience. I went to Luxembourg, and it's the Museum of Modern Art in Luxembourg. And there was this installation where it's a circular room, and there were drums at the top. Like there were lots of like those little drummer boy kind of drums. And what happened is that they played a very interesting collage of Mozart's clarinet concerto. So the one is bum 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 bum. And what happened is that some of the notes are missing, and it seamlessly joins with the other notes. And the whole installation is about having a long voyage to a different country and sort of forgetting some of your memories from the past. And I think while I was sitting there, it was not just the music, it was also the fact that it's just that room, it's that space, it's the way, even the way the sunlight streams in, and the way the drums would vibrate along with the music, creating that tapping sound. And you could really sense the sort of memories. You can really sense that that lament in a way of the memories, sort of losing touch with those memories. And I actually went to listen to it again on YouTube, like a day after, because I was so impacted by that. And it just didn't work for me. I needed to be there. And yeah, I thought what you mentioned about that was very, very, very much true. Yeah. It is why when I look at paintings, I cannot see it on a Google. I cannot go Google Images and, oh wow, this is Picasso. I can't really do that. I really need to be there. I need to sense sometimes even the dimensions of the artwork. That monumentality. I need to really feel it.
Exactly. I mean, even minimalism in its earlier days, it was meant to be experienced live. I think Steve Reich and Philip Glass, in some ways, they have to use the word concert hall to turn it into a more concert hall kind of experience. But if you were to look at Lamont Young, who was actually seen as the father of minimalism, who is actually very, very less known because of the fact that he was, due to many reasons, he was less prone for documentation. So albums released from him is actually quite difficult to come by. And also because of some other issues. It has to be experienced because of the volume, the sustained duration of it. So, for example, he used to have a house back in New York. I'm not sure if he still lives there. So his concerts last for days, literally. You can't find, even with today's digital format, who would actually have the patience or would have the right mindset to listen to his piece that can last for hours, even, right? I actually got hold of one of his DVDs, which actually lasted for 8 hours. It was an excellent piece of music when you're doing something, because it just becomes something that, went on, at the back. But imagine if you were there in the house and you're experiencing it. So the thing is this, is it music still, or is it considered as a piece of performance art? Because it definitely veer into the area of performance art, away from the traditional notion of the concert idea of the performer or the artist with the audience. It really breaks down that whole conception. Yeah. So even without going to sound art and performance art, there are some composers today that can actually break down that barrier quite easily. Yeah. But just to share, actually, minimalism has a huge impact on popular music. I'm not sure if you've heard of this band called Velvet Underground. Velvet Underground, one of the members is called John Cale. He's a classically trained, very gifted. He plays the viola. He was a Welsh. He's a Welsh. He's still living. So he's a Welsh, and when he got a scholarship to NYC, and he actually started playing with Lamont Young back in the 60s. They have a fallout, but before that, he found in a way a musical soulmate called Lou Reed. So together they formed this band called Velvet Underground. And Velvet Underground, you're aware, Andy Warhol's banana, the iconic banana painting, was used as the album cover of the first album of this group called Velvet Underground. There's another visual art / classical / popular music kind of crossover that was happening back in NYC in the late 60s. Yeah. Yeah, see Brian unmuted. Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to mention, not too long ago, do you happen to know the composer Ng Yu Hng? He's maybe Japanese born, but teaches and lives in the US, in California. And Ng Yu Hng is his name. And I saw a piece that sort of, you didn't really know what to think of it as, if it were visual art or musical or somewhere in between. But certainly it wouldn't work just listening to it at home or on headphones or even watching a video of it. It would just be so boring and pointless. But being there and experiencing it was so cool. And at the time, I didn't know if it was cool. It was kind of like a little off-putting and made you feel a bit uncomfortable. But it has stuck with me ever since. And I think it is something quite special, and it's special because it can only be experienced live. I mean, there's no way to duplicate it outside of a real experience. And that's kind of hopeful, I think. Computers aren't going to take that away from us.
Exactly. Actually, Brian, I heard of him, but I have never really dived deep into him. But I can totally get what you're trying to say here. There's also another group that operates more in a heavy music scene called Sun O. So listening to them on even the best sound system that you can get, home domestic sound system, will not be able to duplicate that experience. I have a friend who's an artist himself, Ho Zu Yen. He represented Singapore to present art piece at Venice Biennale about 3-4 years ago, before COVID. He was sharing with me the experience that he had when he went for a Sun O concert. Likewise, another band that need to be experienced live would be My Bloody Valentine, which basically caused him to feel as if he needed all his senses to be activated to fully understand or to fully experience what the musicians originally intend the piece of music to be. So I totally get what Brian is saying here. It could sometimes turn you off, or it give you the apprehensive feeling, right? Like you're not very sure what to make of it. You will be asking, I am not very sure, I'm a bit not certain. That kind of feeling, but yet you're intrigued by it. I thought that is how great art should be like. You know, it's not something that is coffee table. You know,
Mhm.
nothing wrong with coffee table book, but you know, coffee table is not meant to shock. It's not meant to provoke. It's not meant to get you thinking. They're meant to make your living room look nicer, right? For people
Yeah.
to flip through, you know, wait for the coffee and tea to be served, you know, right, when you go to someone's house. So I guess that is something that I totally concur with Brian.
I think similarly, like I've only ever seen videos of Yoko Ono, so I've never had
Oh
a
yes.
chance to experience that. And I know I'm missing it. Like, it's just not that cool to me. But if I were there, I am certain it would have impacted me.
Exactly.
I just saw a video of her, like, she wears this big long red dress, and then she invites audience members or viewers to come with a scissors and cut a small
Oh,
hole.
the cut piece.
Yeah, but this on video is only so effective. Like, could you imagine being there? This would have been such an incredible, unforgettable experience. I mean, the video is interesting enough, but certainly not the same.
I know. Actually, the artist back in the 60s and 70s, another lady whose name is she goes by Mariana Abramovic. If I'm not wrong, she comes from Yugoslavia. Likewise, she also do a lot of kind of performances that is very tactile, that needs to be there. Video and documentation only give you a very, very superficial snapshot of what exactly happened at that point in time. Yeah, so yeah, the performance artists where you don't know, you really do not know how to classify them, right? I mean, they're performing, yes, but
Yeah.
you know, what exactly are they doing? You know, frankly speaking, I mean, it is really something that I guess you need to be there to really, really feel the full impact of it.
You mentioned a little while ago that you were interested in or part of like a noise music scene at now
Yes,
or
yes,
at some time.
yeah.
And I think that's very similar. Like, I rarely find myself listening to noise music at home, occasionally, but quite rare. But going out to see it live is I'm much more likely to do that. I mean, it's because there's something like visceral and
Yes.
immediate about it. But like, my stereo can't reproduce this feeling. And
I know. It's like, okay, so I just to share with you, there's an artist from Australia. His name called Lucas Abela. So he's very interesting because even though he produces noise music, but you know what he does? Okay, the first day he came to Singapore, my friend was the one who brought him around. So he wanted to look for a big piece of glass panel, but the thin type. So, I mean, we have heard of his reputation, but I mean, it was the first time helping him to procure the glass. And then the performance, you know what he did? He basically close mic up the glass and in the inside of his mouth. And the whole piece consists of a very systematic way to break the glass into small pieces. Listening to it, you will never guess that it is glass breaking. But to actually witness it, because my friend actually took a video, that day I wasn't able to be there because I was held at some point. It was very amazing because it was so visceral. It was really like performance art. You know, I don't know if you're familiar with performance art. Back in the 60s, it was very, very bodily, very tactile, sometimes even bodily endangering to the artists themselves. All right. Some of the more famous ones would be the Viennese actionist. All right. Even Yoko Ono's cut piece can be a bit dangerous because you do not know what the participants would do to her, right? If they were a bit careless, they could have cut her, you know, easily. You know where I'm coming from, right? Yeah. So I think this kind of performance is, I would say today you don't really see it. I do not know whether it's because it's been done that people have seen it and done it before, or because the sensibility of people have changed. You know, there's no need to do that because people are beyond shock. Because mainstream movies and entertainment can give you shock values, you know, so easily. But I think it is, no matter what, I think even if you are able to witness something like this or close to this, it would be quite an experience. And I think you really challenge people's idea of what art is, what music is. Yeah, I think that is something that I thought would be quite interesting for people to go through at least once in their life.